was having the initial problem with the starter, and that was that it was not releasing from the start position on the ignition. So you turn it on, turn over to start the motor and release, and the solenoid would stay engaged. So I didn't know what was going on. I replaced the starter, put it in, and then the problem that I was having was that when I would release the ignition from the start position to just to the running position, the spark would die. I came in and started looking at the wiring. Now, the wiring is actually fairly clean and mostly original in this setup. The only thing that I have running hot, and which I need to change, is you see that red wire right there? Well, that's a hot wire that somebody put in for the fuel pump, because the electronic fuel pump wire that runs down on the frame over to the fuel pump is dead. I have no power on that line, which was actually what started this whole process, was trying to figure out what was going on with the electronic fuel pump, because it's on in the accessory switch on the ignition as well as in the on and the on position. So it's on all the time, and I don't want it on all the time. I want it on when I go to turn the motor on, right? I mean, that makes sense. So anyway, I started looking into that, and then I started finding all of these other little electrical problems, these electrical issues. The vehicle was running, and one day I was driving to a friend's house, and I hit a bump, hit a pothole in the road, and I just lost my spark completely. So that's when I started going in through the main ignition, trying to track things down, and that's where I found the regulator, 15 amp regulator fuse was blown. So I went in and did some research, online, of course, which is, hi everybody. Found out that these old fuse blocks were actually prone to that sort of problem, and one of the issues with it is that these contacts get corroded, even though it's covered up. I mean, it's 40 years, for crying out loud. So I went in and cleaned all of those contacts out, thought that that would solve the problem. It did not solve the problem, but it did allow me to start looking for another problem, which takes us back to the ignition. So I replaced the ignition switch, thinking that was probably what it was, because several of the people online said that's what it is. It's the ignition switch. It's the regulator fuse box. It's the regulator, etc., etc. Replaced the ignition switch. That wasn't it. It was still a problem. So now I'm needing to check all of the ignition wiring. Okay. Would rather not, but I will if I have to. And so I do, because electronics is not my thing. I did contact my oldest brother, who came over, and electronics is his thing. And he started running diagnostics on the system. We were finding an open, a shorted line. Came down to the ignition line to the solenoid, and backtracking, I saw that it splits. I had no idea why it should split, so I started tracking the fuse, or I started tracking the harness. So the harness runs up into here, nice and tucked away, like I said, nice all original harness. But what it does here is it splits. There's a Y that comes off of the ignition harness and runs down behind this shroud. I don't know why this has been shrouded like this. Why would it do that? Here's why. because there are two ignition relays that mount to this shroud and need to be protected at all costs because these are expensive. This one is the one that I needed to replace, and it was $50. Now, the irony of that is that that relay isn't even any, doesn't serve any purpose. It's not functional for the setup that I have here. A 4-prong ignition related switch cluster, which would plug in to the original, I think it was a K-hin, the original carburetor that was on this, because it had an electrically activated choke. All right. Well, this Weber doesn't have that. So, yes, black wire, white stripe, black wire, white stripe, yellow stripe, all of the stripes match up. So this is what's going on. Now, why is it a problem? Well, here's why. These relays are built onto an insulator block. This hard plastic insulator block holds the relay, which is under this shroud. This set screw ties the regulator, or ties the relay into the insulator so that it is basically held in air and does not contact any of the metal sides, because it's a hot wire all the time. It's ignition. There's another ignition. Yes, that one ties into the actual ignition switch, because the ignition switch at the dash is also a 5-prong. So this one was good. This one was bad. How did I find that out? Because when I took it off, it rattled around, and what had happened was the set screw had worked itself out. The relay, with a charge to it, started banging around inside the shroud and ended up shorting out. So I had to replace that. Little Phillips head. Make sure that that is snug. And if you're having a problem with your ignition, look for these little puppies, because they are problem children. I could, of course, figure out a way to just bypass this relay, but I don't want to bypass the relay. I want it to be working. I want it to eliminate the electrical issue and not possibly compound the electrical issue. And also this way, if somebody ever wants to put the stock carburetor back on, it's all hooked up and ready to go. So that is the secret sauce, so to speak. That is the secret sauce in the Chevy LUV ignition relays under that shroud. If you're having problems with it, that's probably where it is. And it started out intermittent, so it all fits into play. The diagnosis was appropriate, and the fix was appropriate and accurate, because she runs just like a champ now. Okay, bye.